Hello, students. Welcome to Unit 1C, the Progressive Era, which takes place from 1890 to 1920. Thus far this year, we've looked at the westward expansion in the um, early to mid 1800s. We've looked at the industrialization era, which took place in the mid 1800s to early 1900s. And we also looked at immigration, which is taking place at the same time. Particularly 1880 on, we're looking at that new wave of immigrants or the new immigrants that were different from the earlier ones. The progressive era is going to build upon some of the things we already know. This module is probably going to be the longest one because it's about the origins of progressivism, but you'll be familiar with a lot of the big ideas. So the unit question is, how did the progressive era attempt to address the ills of American society stemming from industrial capitalism, urbanization, and political corruption? These are three concepts that we've already looked at: industrialization, urbanization, or what happens when a bunch of people move to the city, and then political corruption. We talked about political machines and basically how political machines ran local governments because we didn't have that structure in place because we didn't know that cities were going to boom so quickly. So today we're going to talk about how political, economic, and social changes in the late 19th century led to broad progressive reforms. So you will have your guided notes out. These are in your folder, and I'm not sure what color they're going to be, but look for Module 1C1 at the top, Origins of the Progressive Movement. What we're going to do is go to the slide here, and it says slide 3 on your actual paper, and take a look at these vocabulary terms. You're not going to just look at this list. You're going to write these down on your guided reading. So I'm just going to preview some of these for you as you fill it out, but hit pause because you will need more time to write these down. So we're going to talk about the progressive movement today, which was a social reform movement in the early 20th century that looked to fix the problems that came with industrialization and urbanization. Florence Kelley was a social reformer. She worked on helping children and women in the workforce. Prohibition, we'll talk about, which was making the sale or use of alcohol illegal. Temperance, which was the idea that you don't drink alcohol. So a temperance movement meant that you would refrain from alcohol. A muckraker is a writer who exposes wrongdoing. So these were journalists. They were articles for different publications, and they were basically exposing corruption, either in industrialization or in different industries. The Jungle by Upton Sinclair is about the meat packing business, and it was pretty gross. The word muckraker comes from two words, muck and raker. So a person who is a muckraker basically is using a rake like you would use to, get your leaves cleaned up in your yard. But muck is like mud, dirt, gross, like stuff you don't want to stir around. So the idea was that a muckraker was taking the rake of, being a writer and stirring up the bad stuff to expose so people would know these things that were going on behind the scene that were corrupt or unjust. The scientific management is using scientific principles to make the workplace more efficient. We'll see this in the use of the assembly line in different factories. Robert M. La Follette was a progressive Wisconsin governor and senator, and he reformed the railroad industry. And then we'll look at some different laws that were passed, particularly in regard to voting or elections. So an initiative was a way for people to propose a law directly in their local governments. A referendum was if someone was voted into office and you felt like they were not doing their job, you could vote on whether or not to remove that person from office. I'm going to jump down to recall because it goes with this. A recall is a way for people to approve changes in laws by a vote. And then at the bottom, there is the 17th Amendment. This was an amendment that provided for direct elections, particularly of senators. And then back up here is the Illinois Factory Act. And this goes with Florence Kelly over here. Whoops. And Florence Kelly helped to get this law passed, which prohibited child labor and limited women's working hours. If you need to go ahead and pause to continue to look at this, go ahead and do that now. Now we're going to take a minute to reflect here. So this you will write on your paper. This is a little bell ringer. So in the last 2 units, we looked at many issues of industrialization and urbanization. And I want you to write down one issue of industrialization or urbanization that struck a chord with you. Something that maybe you thought was like, my goodness, this must have been awful. Maybe it's child labor. Maybe it's unsafe drinking water. Maybe it is overcrowded tenements with the smell of garbage everywhere. But think about one and write down why this hit a note with you, where you're like, wow, that must have just been awful. Like, I can't imagine living like that. Hit pause so that you can do your writing. So now before we go on to learn about the origins of progressivism, I want to give a little context again. So in the last 2 units, we learned about industrialization, urbanization, and immigration, and these 3 conditions brought about significant problems in the daily lives of cities and city dwellers. So in this lesson, we're going to learn about the social reforms that made up the progressive movement. And this work to fix those issues that came about with industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. So when we're going through this, I want you to think about like each piece of the reforms that progressives did. And if this was an industrialization reform, an urbanization reform, or an immigration reform. So if you look on your your guided notes, it says, what was the aim of the progressive movement? And we're going to focus on making sure that we copy down the bold. So this is really what you want to focus on when you're copying. So on your guide, the progressive movement, so under what was the aim of the progressive movement, all you have to write is that it addressed issues of industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. To kind of expand on that a little bit, they hope to return the control of the government to the people, to restore economic opportunities. So this idea that if you have children working, they're going to drive down wages. We know that workers want to make a fair wage and that big businesses want to make a big profit. So things that would be put into place to help the average person have access to economic opportunities, that it wasn't just that the businesses were profiting and the workers were suffering and not making enough money. And then also to correct the injustices in American life. So now we're going to talk about the 4 broad goals of progressivism. The first goal was to protect social welfare. But before we dig into social welfare, at the turn of the century, between 1890 and 1920, middle-class reformers, so typically white women, we talked about this before with settlement houses, felt that they could help people who needed more access to resources and to more things that would make their lives more comfortable. So in the case of the 4 goals of progressivism, there are 4 main goals that we're going to talk about in this section. We'll talk about protecting social welfare, which is on the screen. We're going to talk about promoting moral improvement. Again, another movement spearheaded by women. And in the next section, we're going to look at how women really were pivotal in the progressive movement. Creating economic reforms, and then fostering efficiency. So in protecting social welfare, the purpose of this was to ease the problems of city life. So people went from living on farms and kind of spread out to these very tight quarters. So different agencies came about. You've probably heard of the YMCA, if not from a song by the Village People. That's fun to do at dances. Maybe you've actually gone to a YMCA. They typically have very similar things that they did to back in the day, where they have classes, swimming pools, different athletic things that you can partake in. So the YMCA, and this stands for the Young Men's Christian Association, and again, building on that idea of the social gospel, that you would get salvation by helping people less fortunate than you. This is a Christian organization. So what they did was they opened libraries. And again, I will give you guys some pointers here. So you can just write down what's in bold: libraries, They sponsored classes, and you can add things like they built recreation or pools and handball courts. So, recreation. The Salvation Army, and you've probably seen this maybe outside of a store around the winter holidays where there's someone with a red bucket ringing a bell. And if you have some change in your pocket, you throw a couple of, coins or dollars into the Salvation Army bucket. What the Salvation Army did was they fed poor people, which they still do today, in what they called soup kitchens. And they also cared for children in nurseries. And these could be children of parents who are working and were not fortunate enough to be able to, pay for childcare. And then another way in which progressives protected social welfare was through settlement houses. We already looked at Jane Addams and the famous Hull House in Chicago, but Florence Kelley also was a part of this movement, and she became an advocate for improving the lives of women and children. And in your definitions, you don't have to write this whole definition down because you already did at the top of your paper. The Illinois Factory Act of 1893 prohibited child labor and limited women's working hours. There was never a national act at this time to ban child labor, so this law became a model for other states. So banning child labor, limiting women's working hours became a state-regulated part of this movement. The second goal we're going to talk about is promoting moral improvement. And there are two terms I want to spotlight here. The first is temperance, this idea that you refrain from alcohol, and this idea of prohibition, which is banning alcoholic beverages. So the idea that this becomes illegal, it's no longer okay to drink. Just want to make sure that you understand those two words. So, interestingly enough, even though social welfare was a goal of progressivism, other reformers felt that morality, not the workplace, held the key to improving the lives for poor people. So, these reformers wanted immigrants and poor city dwellers to uplift themselves by improving their personal behavior. So, at the root of this was this idea of, to be a better person, don't drink. And also part of the idea of this is if men are out, drinking and rabble rousing, they're not at home with their families. So that means they're not taking care of their families. They may be out drinking and doing things that a, married person shouldn't do. So they said that basically drinking was the root of immoral behavior. So the purpose of this was that morality, improving your personal behavior, was the key to improving the lives of the poor people, that they just needed a little bit more morality and their lives would get better. So the prohibitionists, or people who believe that we should ban alcoholic beverages, feared that alcohol was undermining American morals. And this has a little bit of a twinge of like nativism to it, this idea that if you're Christian and American, you're better. Your morals are better than those new immigrants coming over in which drinking is a part of the culture. So that was perceived as being dirty or immoral. So again, a little hint of nativism in these sentiments with the different prohibition movements. So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they were founded in Cleveland in 1874. So go us. So we were all about at that time, or at least the women were banning alcohol in Cleveland. And what happened here was they focused on changing the individual, and they felt that, again, alcohol is undermining morals. So you want to, put a shout out to Cleveland in your notes, and you're going to change the individual, that alcohol undermines morals, and that they went to saloons or bars, and what they would do is they would sing, they would pray, and they would urge saloon keepers to stop selling alcohol, which is interesting because that's how they make their money. This actually became a very well-organized movement, and it became the largest women's group in the country. So I realize that this is not bold. So you can go ahead and pause and make sure that you get the things I underline into your notes. The Anti-Saloon League clashed with immigrants pretty decently, okay? Because they wanted to pass laws to ban alcohol, and they wanted to close saloons. This was problematic because saloons provided services to immigrants, like food service. They had restaurants or like food halls where they could get something to eat after a long day. Check cashing. So if you got paid, banks are still relatively a new thing. So you didn't necessarily go to a bank at this time to cash your checks. And it's interesting because for you guys now, you probably don't even really see your parents going to the bank very often. Maybe the bank machine, but so much money exchange is goes on now, through cyber land. So back in the day, you got a paper check at the end of your pay period. You took it to the bank and you had to have an account typically. And if you had enough money in your account to cover that check, then they would give you the money from your check. So the idea was that you had to have money in the bank so that they could trust you and know that you were good for that check. So then they would give you the money. They would front you the money until that check, quote unquote, cleared from your job. But some saloons would do this also. My dad also talks about when he first started working here in the United States, he didn't have a bank account initially. So he would go to the saloon, and he actually still calls it a saloon, to get his check cashed. So even though this is very early on, even into the 50s and 60s, saloons were part of customary places for immigrants to meet. So many immigrant groups also enjoyed drinking alcohol. So this was a little bit of, again, nativism, this idea that immigrants, because they partake in alcohol, may be less moral. All right, now goal 3 was creating economic reform. And the idea here was that there was a severe economic panic in 1893. You probably have heard of the Great Depression, maybe, maybe not. It happened in, the 1929 through, World War II in the late 1930s. And it's an economic downturn where the economy kind of bottoms out, and it could really be devastating for your average person, and they could, face financial ruin. So the Great Depression is the big depression, but there were several small, what they call panics. So they lasted less years, like they were not as long in duration as the Great Depression, and they were less severe, but they were still pretty devastating. So this economic panic in 1893 led to people questioning whether or not capitalism was the best system to have. And this gets into this idea of capitalism is when the means of productions are owned by private capital holders, like big businesses, even small businesses, that you can regulate a business and that you can provide goods and services to people and that you have the freedom to start a business. Where socialism says that it's an economic and a political system that workers, not big businesses, own the means to production. So very extreme becomes communism. But the idea is that the government might regulate certain services like electricity, gas, etc., instead of big businesses, because everyone needs those things. So it makes more sense that if it's for the people and the people regulate it rather than some individual or small, trust profiting from what people need. So, with the economic reform, like along with moral reformers wanted to create individual behavior or change individual behavior, but Americans started to question economic behavior. So you probably remember maybe Eugene V. Debs. Remember him from the American Railway Union. He starts the American Socialist Party in 1901. So you want to write down Eugene V. Debs. He favored socialism. If you want to, make a note on what socialism here, you can do that. And he basically was saying that there's an uneven balance between big business, government, and people. Okay. You don't have to put all those little descriptors in. You can say that uneven balance between business, government, and people. Another group that sought to create economic reform were those muckrakers. They're journalists. They wrote stories of corruption and unfair business practices. You probably remember Ida Tarbell from 1B2, we talked about racism. She was an muckraker, and she wrote about lynching, but she also wrote about, it was a serial that was in, I think, McClure's magazine, about the history of the Standard Oil company. And she described the company's cutthroat business methods and how this created competition, or they eliminated competition so it wasn't fair. They made a lot of money on something that a lot of people needed. And the last goal is fostering efficiency. This idea of using science or practicality to create more efficient work areas. So, as laws started to limit working hours, businesses were like, well, we got to get more bang for our buck. We need to get more out of our workers. So, they promised to make society and the workplace more efficient. So, scientific management was a technique in which they would analyze how quickly a manufacturing task could be completed, like on an assembly line. You see here, these are part of the wheels of a tire, and each person is doing one step. So if you have a bunch of people lined up and everyone does one step, can you make the pieces faster? And then here's another picture of the assembly line. So assembly lines made people like machines. Okay, so assembly lines, people, like machines. Not everyone could keep up, and it led to worker turnover because people were exhausted, and it was mind-numbing work. If you did one thing over and over and over again, the same thing for, 10, 12 hours a day, it's a bit mind-numbing, and that repetitiveness can really wear on people. So Henry Ford and his idea of the assembly line, when laws reduced the workday to 8 hours, or what he did was he reduced the workday to 8 hours. I'm sorry, and he paid workers $5 a day, which was actually really a lot of money at the time. But many workers were still burned out by this. So there was still worker burnout because it was just a crap job. People did not like to work on assembly lines. It was good money, but people left the profession quickly because it was just unbearable. All right, we are on the second leg of this lecture. So if you need to stop, take a quick break, stretch, do that now, hit pause. So previously, in the four goals of progressivism, we looked at how progressives looked to protect social welfare. They wanted to make sure people were taken care of in the cities with these kind of societal ills. The idea of moral improvement, that if you just took care of your morals, everything would get better. Economic reform and fostering efficiency. And those two things had a lot to do with industrialization. Now we're going to switch over to how urbanization caused issues in government and how progressives tried to change or reform government. A lot of the progressive movement changed things at the local or the state level, which was pretty cool. Now, when we get into lesson 1C.3, we'll look at some progressive changes at the national level, particularly with President Theodore Roosevelt, William Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. But for now, let's go back to our guided notes, and we'll talk about cleaning up local government. So, how do progressives change city or local government? They also wanted to reform politics. Why? Because as we learned about in the last unit, city politics were sometimes corrupt. Party bosses ran cities and they gave jobs to their friends and bribed people for votes. And that's because, again, when cities grew so fast, we didn't have that kind of government to regulate cities. So that's how party bosses came to power and started to run cities, but that didn't benefit everyone, and it also was corrupt. So there were a couple of ways in which they reformed city governments. So one would be the commission system. So instead of having a party boss run the city, they had a group of experts run the city. So the expert takes charge of a different department. So you have maybe different departments in your commission system, and each person at the head of each department knows about that particular thing, like the head of water is an expert in water safety. A expert in crime prevention would manage the police department. So you have experts, not just a friend of a political machine. Council managers is when you elect city council to make laws. We just had an election. I'm doing this, lecture on November 3rd. We had an election yesterday in which we elected city council members. They make the laws. So the council appoints a manager, and the manager has training in public administration. So again, another type of expert that helps to run a city. And then also we had reforming mayors. Cleveland's Tom Johnson. Actually, you can see a statue of him down on Public Square. Believe that citizens should play a more active role in city government. He held meetings actually in a large circus tent and invited people to come in and question officials on how they were running the city. So he encouraged people to actually get involved in politics. And just to put a finer point on it, I have two pictures here. This picture is taken in, oh gosh, Texas, Galveston, Texas. And it was the result of a tidal wave that almost demolished the entire city. And this is actually from Dayton, Ohio, where there was a big flood. One of the reasons why progressives were like, we need to change city or local government is that natural disasters happened, and the cities were not actually equipped to deal with when something devastating happened. I mean, what do? There's nothing left in Galveston, Texas. So there was a huge relief try in Galveston to help the people, and it was completely botched. The rebuilding job was so badly done that the Texas legislature appointed a 5-member commission of experts to take over, and that is how the commission system was born. And then also in Dayton, Ohio, this flood led to the creation of the council manager system because they needed help with the flooding and how do we fix this and how do we get people back to normal. All right, now we're going to talk about how state laws changed. So many states had progressive governors, and these states passed laws to regulate railroads, mines, telephone companies, and other large businesses. And that's where Robert La Follette comes in. He was also called Fighting Bob, that was his nickname. He was the governor of Wisconsin. We're going to see a lot of things coming out of Wisconsin in the progressive era. His goal was to drive big business out of politics. Again, this idea of very similar to the labor unions or going back to our bosses of the Senate, where the big businesses were the ones that were driving political decisions, not the people. So he reformed the railway industry in Wisconsin. So he changed the way that they were taxed. He set limits on rates and that the rates that they could charge so that they weren't being unfair. And then he also cut out other unfair practices. State laws also help to ban child labor. And again, I'll highlight what you need to write down. So children were hired because they performed unskilled jobs for a lower wage. And because children's hands were small, it made them more capable of handling small parts and tools or getting their little tiny hands and arms into machines that were tight so that they could fix something. So for immigrants and farmers, their children needed to work for the family to survive. So family economic survival. They couldn't afford for their kids not to work. So children were more prone to accidents, usually caused by fatigue. They were just so tired. And then many also developed serious health issues and suffered from stunted growth because of the effects of child labor. So this is what I want you to make sure you write down. The National Child Labor Committee in 1904 sent investigators to gather evidence of children working in harsh conditions. They posted photos about the horrors of child labor, and they argued that child labor lowered wages for all workers. So nearly all states passed laws banning child labor. Another way in which states changed laws had to do with limiting work hours. So the Supreme Court showed sympathy for the plight of poor workers and the fact that they were working such long hours. So you want to take note of Mueller versus Oregon in 1908. And it argued that poor working women were much more economically insecure than large corporations. And what this did was I don't know where my pen went. Um, it limited women to working a 10-hour day. Okay. And then Bunting versus Oregon. So these both happen in Oregon, limited 10-hour work days for men. So we see a change in this idea of, you should not have to work, 15, 16, 18 hours a day. And lastly, elections changed. So this goes back to political machines too, and how corrupt they were with votes. We talked about in the last unit in 1B4 how they registered people that were dead to vote and cast ballots in their names, or they bribed people to vote. So the first thing that they did was many states had adopted a secret ballot. A secret ballot means that when you vote, no one knows who you vote for. So we do secret ballots now. You've probably done a secret ballot. If you voted in the student council election, it's a secret ballot. And the idea of that is that you get to vote for who you want to vote for without any intimidation. With political machines, it was an open vote. So even if you didn't want to vote for someone, but they had helped you, or they, maybe you feared losing your job if you didn't vote for the right person. That is what made elections happen, or certain people to win. So the secret ballot took out that piece of corruption. So again, most states had adopted it by 1910, and this is something that is, pretty universally used in the United States at every level of, any government election. But we do this just in our daily practice too, just so that people vote for who they want to vote for or what they want to vote for instead of being influenced by it. Another way in which elections had changed was this idea of initiative. So it gave voters the power. So voters had the power to, we'll say, propose a law. So you can say initiate, introduce, or propose a law. A petition is an example of this. So like if you live on a street that's really, really busy, and there's a stop sign at the end of the street, but it's so busy that maybe the traffic doesn't allow for cars to move, or maybe it's a dangerous intersection, too dangerous to just have a stop sign, you can petition to have a street light put there. And you take a petition and you get people to sign it, and then that can get to the next level in which it is, I'm sorry, I went the other way, in which it is, oh my goodness, what am I doing? Okay, sorry about that. But you can put a law in the books by getting a petition together. Another election change is referendum. This is a companion to the initiative. And in the referendum, if you receive enough signatures on a petition, you can then force the legislature to place a recently passed law on the ballot, okay, allowing for voters to approve or veto the measure. So this goes hand in hand with the initiative. And then last is this idea of recall. So this allows voters to remove an elected official by calling for a special election. Okay, so if someone is in office and you're like, they're not fit, or there's another issue, you can then call for a new election. And last but not least, another way in which elections changed was the passage of the 17th Amendment. So this lends to the direct election of senators. So Wisconsin was the first to use a direct primary, which means that voters, not political machines, would choose the candidates for public office. So again, this moving away from political machines into putting the power to the people, into the hands of the people. So direct primaries led to the passage of the 17th Amendment by the Constitution. And with this, senators were elected directly by the people instead of by state lawmakers who were most likely controlled by political machines. So a more just way of doing elections, a less corrupt way of doing elections, that people are the ones that choose, not the political machines. All right, so we've learned a whole lot. This has been a whopper of a lecture. So we talked about the origin of progressivisms, the four goals of progressivism, and then we also took a look at how the government was reformed through progressive measures, and then lastly, how we had different reforms to elections. So go back to the issue that you identified in explaining your bell ringer and think about which of the four goals of progressivism does this issue fall under. And I'm going to go a little bit deeper with that because did it protect social welfare? So if you talked about child labor, was that social welfare? If you talked about sanitation, is that social welfare or is that fostering efficiency? So the four goals of progressivism are protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement, creating economic reform, and fostering efficiency. So identify which goal that you think that it went ahead and fell under. Now, if it fell under government, you could just say cleaning up government or reforming government. And if it has to do with political machines, it may have to do with election reform. So just think about what you had talked about in your bell ringer and which goal you think it falls under. And last but not least, I will leave you with a joke. Why can't melons marry? Because they can't elope. All right, see you later.